You scroll through the news and feel a familiar, sinking weight. Economic instability, political polarization, and unyielding global conflicts create a suffocating impression that the entire system is fracturing under its own weight. 1,600 years ago, a citizen in the capital of the largest empire on Earth felt that exact same creeping dread. History suggests we are rarely the first people to look around and assume we are the very last. At its apex, the city of Rome held over 1 million residents. Keeping them alive required an intricate, continent-spanning logistical web, shipping thousands of tons of grain from North Africa simply to maintain baseline stability. Grasping the psychological trauma of Rome's eventual collapse requires understanding that inescapable gravitational mass. To an ancient Roman, imagining a world without the empire was as impossible as imagining a world without the sun. Popular imagination often renders the end of that permanence as a sudden, violent explosion, barbarian hordes storming the gates and burning civilization to the ground overnight. The actual history is far more tedious. By the 3rd century, the empire had grown too massive for one person to govern, leading to a strategic split into an eastern half based in Constantinople and a western half centered in Italy. This data reveals the fatal trajectory of the Western Empire over the 4th and 5th centuries. As weathering dried up due to elite tax evasion, the treasury was unable to sustain the legions, forcing the state to rely on foreign mercenaries who frequently held their own political agendas. The Western Empire succumbed to a chronic, centuries-long wasting disease, defined by bureaucratic stagnation and economic exhaustion. Historians frequently cite 476 AD as the official expiration date for the Western Roman Empire. That year, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed Romulus of Aestulus, a teenage emperor who functioned as little more than a figurehead. Odoacer simply packed up the imperial insignia and mailed it to the emperor in the east, officially declaring that the West no longer required its own ruler. While the general public barely noticed this bureaucratic shift, the intellectual elite were devastated. Contemporary figures like Jerome wept over the city's loss of status, and Augustine spent years writing The City of God to process the shattering of Rome's perceived legitimacy. The ancient political world concluded with the equivalent of a quiet resignation letter folded into a desk drawer. Modern historians remain divided between the Transformation School, which sees cultural continuity, and the Catastrophe School, which argues for a violent end to civilization. Archaeological evidence supports the Catastrophe School, showing that pottery quality and average cattle size plummeted after the collapse. The shattering of imperial trade networks threw parts of Western Europe back to prehistoric levels of material wealth. Conversely, scholars like Peter Brown redefined this era as late antiquity, viewing it as a period of creative religious and cultural evolution, where the Roman world mutated into the foundations of medieval Christendom. This temperature graph reveals an environmental culprit. The empire flourished during the warm, stable Roman climate optimum, but buckling under the late antique Little Ice Age led to successive crop failures and the rapid spread of the Justinian plague. These readings suggest the empire was overwhelmed by the combined crushing weight of climate instability, pandemic disease, and institutional rot. In the 18th century, Edward Gibbon used the decline of Rome as a warning for the British Enlightenment, blaming a loss of martial spirit on the influence of the church and a bloated bureaucracy. Victorian imperialists later used Rome as a mirror to navigate their own concerns about imperial overstretch, terrified that their global footprint was condemned to repeat the ancient pattern of decay. Today, that same narrative is weaponized to stoke hostility against migrants. By framing modern change as civilizational erasure, contemporary movements use the fall of Rome to justify a deep-seated fear of the outsider. We reach for these analogies because they provide a sense of order to our anxieties, transforming the chaotic unknown of the future into a predictable historical cycle. These fears are often fueled by declinism, a cognitive bias that idealizes an imagined stable past while ignoring the present's capacity for adaptation. While the loss of central authority brought significant material hardship, some historians view the collapse as a lucky break for Europe. It dismantled a stagnant power monopoly that had dominated the continent for centuries. This rupture fostered a decentralized and violently competitive state system. This fragmentation created the friction that eventually allowed Europe to evolve toward modernity. Rome is simply the name we give to our fear of the end and our hope for what might emerge from the wreckage.